I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, the Fetzer Institute, Millions of Conversations, and Vanderbilt University for enabling us to come together today. I especially want to thank Samar Ali and Sharif Azami, my compatriots, for conceiving of this idea and being such amazing partners throughout. And we also want to thank Megan Campbell and Mary Tezak for their incredibly hard work in orchestrating this day. Today's Depolarization Summit is an outgrowth of an effort that started 3 years ago in the wake of the Unite the Right rally. Afterward, I had conversations with several organizations, including the Anti-Defamation League, the Charles Koch Institute, and the Fetzer Institute, about how we could harness and share learnings about our work against extremism. I'm seeing some comments pop up in the chat box. Eileen is writing about peacekeeping at a Philadelphia march after the election and passing people who are yelling hateful things at us. A conversation with my neighbor, family member demonizing poll workers, lost contact with childhood, lifetime friend, and family member. That really puts a personal stake. It highlights how personal these phenomena are right now. All right, so after, and everybody keep on checking out what people are putting there. Afterward, we created a capacity building coalition called Communities Overcoming Extremism, which over a period of 18 months held 2 national summits for public and private sector leaders and created a podcast, which is called Overcoming Extremism, and a final report, all highlighting learning, alliances, initiatives, and best practices. There were very specific instances that came out of this that really spoke to me personally. About a year after the rally in Charlottesville, I was called by a friend who was the mayor of a large southern city, and he said they had a potential violent confrontation between 2 groups that was just about to happen the next day, and he had 15 minutes before he was meeting with his police chief, and what could I share from Charlottesville? And that's how mayors talk frequently. And in that 15 minutes, I shared a few very specific lessons we'd learned from Charlottesville. Move heaven and earth to separate the 2 groups, do tabletop exercises to think through what might go wrong, place a premium on communication, both to your public and stakeholders inside the government, avoid standoffs and turf battles, try to get intelligence on planning happening in the internet. He thanked me and later said the advice helped. Sharing and growing such collective wisdom, especially between people who know each other, who are allies, is one of the ways that we grow through the challenges that we have today. We are all facing polarization in our lives, whether at micro or macro levels, and you're seeing, again, in the chat, some of this, developing a curriculum from Henry, scenario planning from Cheryl, and training, reaching across the political divide, writing an op-ed by Dawn. But there are also many advances being made, again, at micro and macro levels against polarization and through the efforts of many people you will see and meet today. Communities Overcoming Extremism's final report highlighted a framework that applies just as well to polarization as to extremism. We concluded throughout that project that we must shift, first of all, to a proactive stance in overcoming extremism before, during, and after events, and that this proactivity could have what you would call both hard and soft dimensions to it. The quote unquote hard side was the traditional tools of government: investigation, prosecution, protection, the police powers of government, the powers that come through law enforcement. The soft side is civil society, schools, nonprofits, the private sector, which can reach out to marginalized populations to prevent them from being radicalized or victimized. You will see discussion of both sides of that work today as it applies to polarization and depolarization. Just like any good meeting, any great conference, we hope you will come away from today's session changed. The mission for this summit is to increase your capacity for this work, for the work of tackling depolarization, whether that is through a new friend you make, an organization you want to support, ideas or support you gather for your work, or new ideas or best practices that may germinate in the future. That is our goal. And we will be following up with all of you after this. Just like any good meeting, we have tried to set the day up for maximal interaction between our panelists and among all of you. We have breakout sessions limited to 15 people after each panel, and we have given instruction to the moderators or the groups that will be self-moderated of guideposts to try and enhance engagement and interaction. But we also have limited time, so I will urge everyone to be respectful of everyone's time and to try and make space for everyone who wants to share. A final beginning note for everybody to know: today's meeting is being recorded and is open to everyone here, and there may be press watching, so by your participation, you agree to be recorded, and please be mindful that that lots of folks, including members of the press, may be observing. I want to conclude by, yeah, there's great comments here. Carlos is talking about reimagining our time in wilderness dialogues. Jean is talking about being a city commissioner who had to deal with a visit from the Proud Boys. Marge is talking about telling white suburban women in a book club that she'd started watching Fox so she can understand what the other side is hearing. Marge happens to be my mom. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to my friend and colleague, Samar Ali, who is the founding president and CEO of Millions of Conversations, and who we both came up with this idea at the very beginning. So Samar.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. And here we are, November 19th. It's so great to be with you. And I also just want to extend a huge thank you to everyone who's both joining us and also who helped make this summit happen, from Vanderbilt University, the Fetzer Institute, to you, Mike. I remember the conversation that we had in July when we were talking about just the notable tensions that were rising in the country and our concern about it. We've been having this conversation, quite frankly, for 2 years. We first started this discussion in the September of 2018. And that leads me to this point is that this is really truly a process. This isn't just a one-day event that we're all coming together to talk about depolarization and how we work on this in our country, but it's about really how do we deal with the tensions in the country at this moment and put ourselves on a path this decade so that we can really bring our country together. So this is why we actually formed Millions of Conversations, which is focused on bringing Americans together to transcend divides by uniting Americans around common values for a shared future. Ultimately, we do this through a 7-step process that we believe will take us to sustainable peace. We often have people ask us, how do we achieve peace? How do we find peace? We just want that for our country. We want that for our neighborhoods. We want that for our communities. So we put together the 7-step process, which I'm just going to very quickly share now. And it starts with a pledge to listen. By listening to each other, this then leads to a humanization process. When we begin to humanize, that's when step 3 happens, which is we begin to empathize. When we empathize, we explore what are our common values, and we're looking for that common ground. Once we tend to find that common ground, that takes us into what's a very important step, which is step 5, and that is a commitment to a shared future. And this is really when we ask for people to restore agency, because by committing to a shared future, that is when people opt in rather than opt out and say, I'm a part of this community and I care about what happens to us. And then the 6th step that then happens, because we have our past that we have to deal with and we have the present, and it's a very difficult one, and that's the truth and reconciliation process. And once we go through that, we then successfully have found sustainable peace. This is a process which, in my opinion, will probably take us a decade if we do it right. And finally, just to say, by engaging in this process, we also counter narratives that demonize the other. And that allows us to disrupt these cycles that we're constantly watching play out again and again and again, which Mary McCord is going to talk about in a moment, which are those cycles of fear, hate, and violence. By changing the narrative, we disrupt these cycles of fear, hate, and violence, which is why our summit today is more important than ever. By bringing together experts from around the country, I'm so excited that everyone is getting a chance to have this timely conversation so that we can roll our sleeves up together and rebuild our public square and really create an ecosystem that allows us to thrive. And without further ado, I'm excited to announce our other partner, Sharif Azami, who's a senior programmatic officer at the Fetzer Institute in Michigan. Sharif, over to you.
Thank you, Samar. Good morning. I'm really excited today. My work at Fetzer is to help support our work on healing the heart of American democracy. So as we start this, I'm just really grateful to the team that really worked really hard to put this event together, but also then to everyone who agreed to participate in the panels and also to just participate in the event. In that sense, I really see this as a kind of a major coming together of a tribe. The indigenous traditions have a very different notion of tribe. It's a notion of belonging and not separation, a notion of flourishing in community, and a kind of a notion of co-creating and shared responsibility. So I really see this event and the level of yeses that we had, 400 people almost, really see that as that kind of measure coming together of a community or a tribe. So as we convene, I just want to share that at the Fetzer Institute, when we started our work prior to the 2016 election around healing the heart of American democracy, we understood polarization as a heart level challenge. We were concerned by the loss of solidarity and how rapidly the country was headed toward a fight or flight mode, or at the individual level, how Americans were starting to see fellow citizens on the opposite side as just not wrong, but evil. Our president and CEO, Bob Weischer, will speak about this heart level challenge toward the closing of this summit. I hope you will have a chance to hear him speak about this challenge. I personally want to start this summit by highlighting two trends that I think are very relevant to our gathering today. First, even as we emerge from the 2020 election, it is evident that the country is deeply divided. The division is not just between racial lines, minorities versus majority, left versus right, urban versus rural, haves versus have-nots. It is also often very present among in-groups and families. So on that end, I think we have a lot of work to do, not only to proactively mitigate threats, but also to heal communities and build a more flourishing democracy for all. Second, and on a more optimistic note, I think we're closing to reaching a critical mass in terms of a tipping point in building a strong field of bridge building. Back in 2014, when we started our initiative, organizations working in this field were scattered. And both within civil society and government, many would not even acknowledge or recognize this as a field. But now I think that has changed. So the question for me is, how might we build on the momentum that we have created and foster a more comprehensive movement for healing and bridging divides, while also not peppering over the deep grievances and suffering that is present across America? So with these two highlights, I would like to again request Mayor Signer to introduce our wonderful plenary speakers, and I look forward to learning from your wisdom and insights. Again, thank you so much for your participation. Mike, back to you.
Thank you, Sharif. With that, I want to introduce our first keynote speaker, my friend Mayor Steve Benjamin of Columbia, South Carolina. Steve and I first met at the White House when Barack Obama was president during a meeting of the US Conference of Mayors. This was, I believe, before he showed the nation his exemplary leadership of the capital city of South Carolina during the horrific attacks there in Charleston, and he later became president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, whereupon he led several initiatives to strengthen our emphasis on reconciliation and navigating through our time, especially at the community level. And so we're delighted to have Mayor Benjamin with us today. And Mayor, if I could turn it over to you.
I'm delighted to join you, my friend, Mike. Thank you to the Fetzer Institute and to Vanderbilt and all the wonderful leaders who have helped pull together this discussion today, a discussion that I'm sure many of us, Mike, back in the good old days of visiting the White House with President Obama, didn't believe that was a conversation we'd have to have in America in 2020. For those of you who've not had the privilege of visiting Columbia, South Carolina, when Columbia was chartered as America's first planned capital city more than 200 years ago, Senator John Gervais, as the Senate was debating what the name of the city would be, came down to two finalists of Washington and Columbia. Columbia being not only a derivation of Columbus, but the name that had been illuminated by the poet Phyllis Wheatley in her letters to General Washington as representing this new nation. He advocated for Columbia and hoped that the oppressed of all lands might find refuge under the wings of Columbia. I'm sure that at those critical days, in the early days of our republic, Senator Gervais did not fully understand how prescient that quote was. He couldn't have imagined that in the year 2020, that our citizens and residents would hail from every one of the 194 sovereign nations of the world, speak 90 different languages, and practice dozens of religions, that this city would and could become an inclusive and dynamic city of the New South, built by his peers and freed Africans, by Irish indentured servants and resilient and faithful Jewish immigrants, and now a more diverse core of citizens you could ever imagine. We have been enriched by the strength of diversity and inclusion. As a public servant, as a student and a student of history, I've made it a priority to learn from our collective past, realizing it's impossible to understand the power of human potential without a full and comprehensive history of knowledge of our history. The current vilification of Muslims, of Chinese citizens, immigrants from Mexico and Central America. That was a wise observation by the historian John Meacham as he addressed mayors last week. He talked about exactly how far this country has come, in the realization that maybe the birth of this country actually was in 1965. This America that we all speak of, being constant architects. 1965 was probably our first year in post-apartheid America. Understanding our history meant that we had to fully understand the role that Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Germany and their role in their attempts to eradicate an entire race, and they successfully murdered over 6 million Jews in the 20th century. That this should serve as a reminder for all of us in public office that these are not distant memories of hundreds of years ago. That the dangers we face when we allow anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and all forms of hate to march forward unchecked. My experience as president of the United States Conference of Mayors was informed heavily by Mike's leadership and experience and the pain suffered in Charlottesville. Immediately, over 300 mayors organized by the U.S. Conference of Mayors stepped up and signed a compact against hate and extremism. It laid the foundation for what would become our rallying cry for the following 2 years, that yes, we would focus, as mayors do, on infrastructure. Yes, we would focus on innovation and in capturing the dynamic changes that are happening in technology all across the globe. But at the core of who we were, core of who we are, we must focus on inclusion and how we build cities and communities that focus on each and every one of us living up to our full potential. So as president of the United States Conference of Mayors, I had the opportunity to establish the Mayors and Business Leaders Center for Inclusive and Compassionate Cities. It's a center that makes our efforts very intentional. There's some things that for years we assumed that everyone would do. We assumed that everyone would gravitate towards our better angels, but would support mayors' efforts to try and make cities across the nation more equitable, more inclusive, and more compassionate. We started that year in Tornillo, protesting the separation of children from their mother's breasts and father's arms, one of the greatest moral challenges of our time. We studied America's history of chattel slavery, human chattel slavery, racism and lynching, and oppression at Montgomery, Alabama's Center, National Memorial for Peace and Justice. We prayed together in Auschwitz and Birkenau for strength and conviction and the power of discernment as we continue to deal with some of those very same issues in our country. Our 2019 visit to Auschwitz put the horrors faced by over 1 million Jewish families, thousands of Poles, Roma, and prisoners on full display for us. And as adult men, we wept. We wept as we walked through the gates of death and witnessed empty cans of Zyklon B used to poison innocents. And we reflected on the world in which we live and the lives lost and decided that we needed to be doing so much more, that there was so much more. And we've seen that incredible leadership in America's cities, north, south, east, and west. Still today in America, we're struggling to deal with issues that many of us felt that we put to bed decades ago. Even our nation's capital, angry protesters waved flags and swastikas that brave young men stormed the battlefield at Gettysburg and beaches at Normandy to defeat not only hate speech and divisive racial, ethnic, and religious rhetoric, but an endless barrage of bitterness on the news every night, the hate and vitriol that we see even coming from the what we consider to be the world's greatest temple of democracy. It's not the America we know, not the America we love, and we refuse to believe that this is a dark reflection of who we actually are. We determined that in Columbia, in Chattanooga, in Louisville, in Anaheim, California, in all corners of this country, that we were going to love each other. We would build a world focused not only on tolerance, but on respect, compassion, inclusion, and action. We decided our mandate was to build compassionate communities that allow every child of God to live up to his or her potential. Every child. There'd be no room for hatred, xenophobia, homophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, bigotry, or racism. And we determined that we had to use our opportunities as policymakers, understanding that our power and leadership comes from those that we serve, that we had to truly put policies in place that would enforce true systemic and structural change. In Columbia, we have our Commission on Compassion and Inclusion. We've established a commission on the future of Columbia that works to bring people together in these very difficult times. As we work through the greatest pandemic in 100 years, since 1918, we worked through the greatest economic disruption that we've seen in certain election years since 1932 or 1876, depending on which historian you speak to, and the greatest social unrest around systemic racism and police violence since 1968, all wrapped up into this incredible year of 2020, and determined that we need to make sure that we're intentional and moving forward. And that's why I'm so excited to be here with you today, not just here in Columbia, Andy Burke's Council Against Hate in Chattanooga, Greg Fisher's Lean in Louisville, efforts all across the country on the local level. We've determined that even in spite of maybe not having the national leadership now working to bring us together, that in these great metropolitan areas where now 85% of America's populations live, if we lead, again, with intention, we can do things. And it's become that much more difficult now. Obviously, we know in the past that as we've had challenging issues, usually we pull people together, we break bread, we respect our various religious traditions, and we have a chance to come together. It's difficult now in the pandemic. So when we talk about social distancing, we want to stress the need for social cohesion. So I'll wrap and I'll say this, just a few words to the wise as each and every one of you goes through doing the amazing work that you do. Just words of thank you, in the words of the great Elie Wiesel, of blessed memory. We must swear to never be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. So I want you all to know that we build what we believe. Our future is subjective. Two communities equally yoked. That one decides to tackle this head on, bringing people together, and the other chooses not to, will be two very different communities. One very prosperous, one less prosperous, just a few years from now. And understand the fact that, as was stated earlier, we all suffer from some degree of experiential blindness, that we can see the same information, see it very differently. Understand that we start there, but we can come together here. Understand that there's power in humility. Understanding that we don't know everything. We're not supposed to know everything. Be good at not knowing and constantly learn. And if we do that, we can certainly take this pain and passion and truly make progress together. I want to encourage you that your experiences that we saw just in the chat earlier, that you, in this world that values data so much, you are humanized data to tell your stories, that your stories matter. Keep talking, keep teaching, keep sharing. And remember that if we do this right, as Dr. Cornel West even says, that justice is indeed what love looks like in public. We can get there, but it's going to take the incredible dedicated work of each and every one of you to get there. So thank you, and thank you for allowing me to share some time with you this morning. God bless. think you're still muted,
Mayor,
Mike.
sorry. Thank you so much. I think I'm speaking for everybody in saying I am glad that we are recording this so that more folks are going to get a chance to hear those words. That brought me in mind of the where there's no vision, the people will perish. And it's really powerful to hear such a specific vision from a real servant leader like yourself. So thank you. I wanted to now introduce my friend Mary McCord. Mary is legal director at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. She was the acting assistant attorney general for national security at the Department of Justice from 2016 to 2017 and principal deputy assistant attorney general for the National Security Division before that. And she has been, she has been in the news so broadly and for so many different reasons as a valued commentator, but also as an agent of change in trying to wrest our government back into a position of control over the political violence that is the most extreme instance of the partisanship that or the polarization that we have seen. And we worked together on a lawsuit to successfully prevent the militia groups that invaded Charlottesville from reinvading using a 200-year-old constitutional provision in Virginia's Constitution, which she has now been replicating around the country. So it's really a pleasure to have you join us as our keynote, Mary, and please take it away.
Thanks so much, Mike and Samar and Sharif and all of your institutes for bringing us together today. So I just keying off some of the things we've just heard in the opening conversations, it brings me back to the statement made by President Trump right after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, when he said that there were very fine people on both sides. And ever since then, sidedness has been a thing that we've been battling. Not that that was the first time that America was ever broken into sides, that's for sure. But I think it's been very much sides on steroids for the last nearly 4 years. We saw that early on. Either you were on the side that believed that the Russians tried to interfere with our 2016 election, or you were on the side that believed it was a hoax. You were either on the side that actually thought that the allegations made by the Ukraine whistleblower were serious and concerns, or you were on the side that believed that that was a hoax. This year, it's been amped up even more. You're either on the side that believes that we need public safety measures such as masks and social distancing in order to prevent further spread of the pandemic, which has killed 250,000 Americans, or you're on the side that thinks that those types of public health measures are threats to your individual liberties and rights that have to be opposed. You're either on the side that believes that there are legitimate claims of racial injustice that date back for centuries in this country and that deserve attention, or you're on the side that believes that the racial justice demonstrations this summer and demonstrations against police brutality are just opportunities for violent anarchists to take over our cities. And now, more than ever, in the wake of the election, we see the sides coming out even more. You're either on the side that believes that the election results are valid and that there's been no widespread fraud, which is what all of the evidence shows, or you're on the side that believes that Joe Biden has stolen the election and that President Trump is the legitimate victor. And this sidedness would be problem enough. And we're going to be talking about that with people throughout the day. People are much more qualified than I to talk about how we bridge the gap of that sidedness. But what concerns me as a lawyer and as a former counterterrorism expert and a former prosecutor is that now we've added something to the rhetoric. We've added firearms, we've added armed, unlawful militia activity, and the far right has actually pulled more people into that tent of believing that taking up arms and organizing yourself, either whether it's in opposition, armed opposition to the government, as we saw in Lansing, Michigan, in Ohio, in Kentucky, in Idaho, and other places, armed unlawful militias literally storming the State House to intimidate and coerce legislators into changing their views about policy, or whether it's supposed augmentation of legitimate law enforcement, self-deploying while heavily armed down on the streets to quote unquote protect property, or sometimes protect statutes, Confederate statutes, statutes of Spanish conquistadors. Either way, these armed groups, they have no authority. They're not protected by the First or Second Amendment, and they present a threat to public safety, not just public safety of those on the left, but everyone's public safety, including the safety of law enforcement. And so while others will be better to speak to bridging the divides, and Samar has been so amazing in her work with millions of conversations, there's something I want to talk about for my remaining time, which is that how does the law fit into this? Because we value in this country our First Amendment rights. We value the ability to have opposing views and to express those through peaceful assembly, through marches, through demonstrations, through protests, through rallies. But sometimes I think we have taken absolutist views of our constitutional rights that aren't supported by the text of the Constitution, our history, or Supreme Court interpretation. So for example, the First Amendment does not protect violence. It does not protect incitement to violence, incitement to imminent lawless action, including threats and intimidation, including of our election poll workers who are working so hard across the country, Republican and Democrat, to tabulate the votes, to certify the votes, and to follow the state processes under law. The Second Amendment, this is where the mythology is so wide and so vast, and course correction is necessary. Many of the unlawful armed militia groups that we have seen more and more and more deploying in public over the last 3.5 years, they will point to the Second Amendment as their authority for existence, but they could not be more wrong. They'll point to the words well-regulated militia in the US Constitution and in state constitutions and say, well, that's us. We have our own self-regulation. That's our authority to exist in opposition to the tyranny of the government. But if you go back in our history, even before our independence, even before the founding, the militia acts in the colonies made clear that well-regulated meant regulated by the government. At that time, they did not want to have standing armies, which they saw as a threat to their liberty. So they thought, we will use militias, all people, all residents available to be called forth by the governor in defense of the state when we need to defend ourselves. But always when called forth, it was in defense of the state, under the control of the state, under the authority of the state. That was baked into our US Constitution. It was baked into the constitutions of every state. Well-regulated means well-regulated by the governor. The only lawful militia in a state is the National Guard or other state militias that report to the governor. These armed groups will point to the Second Amendment's individual right to bear arms in an open carry state and say, that's our authority. That's why we're able to band together and engage in armed projection of authority over others. But that doesn't bear out either. For all the gray areas in the Second Amendment, this is not one of them. The Supreme Court was clear as far back as 1886 that the Second Amendment does not protect private armed groups of paramilitary organizations. In 1886, it upheld a state statute that still exists on the books of 29 states to this day that prohibits groups of men, bodies of men, from associating together as military units or parading or drilling in public with firearms. And what the Supreme Court said back in 1886 is that it must be the case, it was without question, that states must be able to prevent private paramilitary organizations in order to protect public safety, peace, and good order. In 2008, when Justice Scalia wrote for the majority in District of Columbia versus Heller, the case that established for the first time that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms for one's own self-defense, he pointedly contrasted that with paramilitary organizations, emphasizing that those are not protected. In fact, that no one had even argued otherwise. And indeed, all 50 states prohibit private, unlawful paramilitary organizations. only the state, only the governor has authority to bring forth people in defense of the state, bring forth people armed to exert authority over the others. And it's those laws that Mike referenced that we worked with the city of Charlottesville, local businesses and local residents to bring a lawsuit against the paramilitary organizations, the neo-Nazi organizations, all the white nationalist organizations, and the self-professed militias who invaded Charlottesville at the Unite the Right rally, coordinated their armed activity, either with their AR-15s and their full military gear, or with their shields and their pointed spears that they used offensively against counter-protesters. We were successful in using litigation to obtain court orders to prevent a repeat of that type of activity during protests and rallies. We've since then published an extensive legal toolkit, which I'll put in the chat after I finish speaking, that's made for local and state officials and activists and concerned residents to be able to see, with footnotes and case citations and all that boring stuff that other people don't like, but to see what authorities state and local officials have to protect public safety while not running afoul of First and Second Amendment rights. And we've been privileged to consult with state and local officials across the country to try to, when they're trying to protect their communities against the threat of far right and frankly far left extremists, particularly as they take up arms. Now more than ever, that is important. We saw coming into the election the threat that armed militias might show up at the polls to intimidate voters. And we went on a campaign. We put out state fact sheets for every single state, explaining the laws that prohibit this type of armed intimidation, explaining voter intimidation laws. We met with state attorneys general. We met with district attorneys, police chiefs, the US Conference of Mayors I had the privilege of addressing on 2 separate occasions. And it was the aha moment for them. We don't have to tolerate these armed groups. They are not protected by the Constitution. And unfortunately, they feed into the extremist narrative. And they're currently, particularly in the wake of the election, they're trying to pull more centrist people toward their view of what's happening in our country, their view that the election is stolen, their view that, taking up arms might be necessary. This is what failed democracies do. This isn't what our democracy does. And so as we go into the conversations today, I know we're focused on bridging divides, bridging gaps, and these things are so important. But when the law can be a helpful tool, it's one that lawyers are there to assist with. And in fact, it's not just my organization at Georgetown, but we've actually brought together a coalition of nationwide law firms, the big name law firms, Republicans and Democrats, and in those law firms, united to provide pro bono assistance to state and local officials as they try to combat the threats of armed activity. This shows this issue, this should not be a sides issue. This should not be Republicans versus Democrats, conservatives versus liberal. This is about our democracy. It's about what we do to protect it. It's about protecting the legitimate exercise of constitutional rights that we all want to protect, while also making everyone feel that they can safely go about exercising those rights. And I look forward to the conversation as the day wears on.